everybody, and welcome to another beautiful Thursday morning. You're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network. And I have a great show for all of you today. My guest will be Heidi Hutner. She is a professor at Stony Brook University, where she teaches about sustainability and ecofeminism and the environment. She is also the director and producer of a new film coming out called Accidents Can Happen. And I'm really excited to have her on. I'll tell you more about her when she is ready to come on. But first, I want to share with you some things going on in and around the news, some ways you can take action, and of course, share my weekly recipe with you. So first, during this COVID-19 pandemic that we are all living through, times have really changed. And one of the silver linings that's coming out of this is that an awareness about our food system is really coming into play. People are starting to pay attention to our food chain and how things get to us and where they can break down and who's responsible for picking the vegetables and getting the vegetables to the wholesalers so that we can get it in the marketplace. And during this time, I think because people are becoming so aware of the fragility of our food system, more and more people are reaching out to farmers to directly purchase fresh fruits and vegetables from local farmers. And that program that so many people are relying on and are falling back to is called Community Supported Agriculture, also known as CSA. And CSA is really, I think, the best way to get your hands on a weekly harvest of freshly picked vegetables that are in season, that are local. However, one thing I want to also bring to everyone's awareness is where traditionally CSA was a model that organic and sustainable small farmers were using. Now larger farms who have also lost their access to restaurants and universities and have a lot of produce on their hands, and they see that people are reaching out to local farmers, they're trying to cash in on this as well. So make sure, if you do buy into a CSA, make sure that you're buying into a farm where they are using organic methods, whether they're certified organic or not. The important thing is that they are not spraying with pesticides, herbicides, that they're using organic seeds, and that the way that they're taking care of the fields is in harmony with the planet. That's really, really so important. And it's also important to know that the model of a CSA is that you're buying directly from the farmer. What we're also starting to see now are new business models where people are calling it a CSA, but it's really a middle person. It's a middle person that's willing to deliver to your home, but they're going to the farms and getting things, and they're going to many different farms and putting together a basket for you that might be combined with all kinds of things, including toilet paper and paper towel. And that's not a CSA. A CSA is really you going directly to the farmer and having a relationship with that farm. So look into that as you're supporting CSAs and really know the farmer. It's really such a nice thing. And hopefully, as we get through this pandemic, the farms will be able to open up and welcome you onto the farm. That's also usually been part of the model, is that you are a part of the farm, and the farmers usually have, open houses, whether you can come harvest or plant or just sharing a good meal and a great day in the outdoors. That's also traditionally been a part of being a CSA member. So that's something to think about. Also during this pandemic, reading articles about the amount of food waste is just making me crazy. They are taking whole fields of onions and just turning them in because they've lost their market. Exports are down or non-existent. Restaurants are closed, universities are closed, and so big restaurant groups and people that buy so much of this produce is just not happening. So that doesn't have a market, and or they can't get it to the people that need it. I mean, at the same time, while we have all this excess food that's being just turned into the soil, we also have food banks dying for some fresh produce. And why can't we figure out a way for our government to take this excess produce and deliver it to those that need it? You know, I know it's all about money and profit, and it's just a shame because we have some great, great produce that is just getting turned into the soil. You know, I was reading about millions of gallons of milk that's just being dumped into the lagoon. It's just a crime. You know, these farmers work so hard to grow these vegetables. We really need to get them to people who can use them. So food waste is a big, big issue. Actually, yesterday in the New York Times, there was actually a great article. It missed my newsletter, so I'll write about it for next week, but a great article on the expiration dates that food manufacturers put on food, and that these expiration dates are just arbitrary. They really have no substantial proof as to why they put them there. And they actually say, they just kind of just guess, oh, well, this will be good for a month. This will be good for 2 months. Oh, this will be good for 6 months. The reality is most of these foods can last much, much longer, and that the expiration dates really don't mean anything. So I can share a story with you where I bought sour cream for feeding the homeless, and I buy it in a big tub when I'm making mashed potatoes for Thanksgiving. And I had a whole big tub left over. And I didn't want to open it to see if it was still good. I wanted to keep it sealed, and I saved it for the whole year till the following year, and it was perfect. It was perfect. And I was able to use it again this past Thanksgiving. Had I opened it, then it would have started the process of going bad. But it really lasted for such a long time, and it was perfect. And I was really tempted many times to throw it out. I was like, there's no way it's going to be good. But I didn't. And so that's just something to really keep in mind, that food waste is a big issue, and don't just throw something out. Use your senses. Use your eyes. Use your nose. If it's bulging, it's bad. If it smells bad, if it's discolored. But otherwise, it's okay. And spices will last forever. They might lose some of their potency, so instead of 1 teaspoon, you might use 2 teaspoons, but they don't go bad. So just keep all of that in mind. Also on my website, I do have a lot of ways that you can take action. I'm sure you have heard about the Trump administration trying to roll back the standards on school lunch. As a farm-to-school coordinator and someone who has always been passionate about school lunches and getting food to kids that need it, these rollbacks are just horrendous. And this week, it was actually the proposal that the administration was proposing to roll back the standards on whole grains and sodium was denied. And that's a great win for us. So thank you to all of you who signed petitions that I had up. But we have another one coming up where he's trying to roll back the standards for fresh fruits and vegetables. And we really don't want that to happen. We have until April 22nd for people to comment on that. So I have a petition on my website where you can sign up for that. School food is still so important, and even when schools are closed right now, the people in my kitchen at Glen Cove and schools across the country, the cafeteria workers are still coming in and putting together lunches for these kids. We also have a food pantry at our school where families are coming by every week and picking up a box full of food. There's lots of people out there really hurting, and we need to get food into the food banks and find a way to get the food chain where all that food's getting dumped into these food banks because they need it. And now it's my pleasure to share with you my weekly recipe. This is actually the recipe that I made last month in the school district for the kids to try, and we ended up getting shut down, so all the kids didn't get to try it, but it ended up being the side salad in all of the lunch bags that the kids were getting for a few weeks. So this is a kale and Napa cabbage salad with carrots and cranberries, and I serve it with a Japanese dressing. It's a ginger dressing that is just so good. So for the ingredients, and you can cut back, you can cut this in half if this is too much for your family. 6 cups of kale leaves that are chopped, 12 cups of Napa cabbage leaves cut into thin slivers, 2 cups of grated carrots, about 6 large carrots, 2 cups of dried cranberries, 3 tablespoons of olive oil, and a quarter teaspoon of salt. And that's for the salad part. And then the dressing, the ingredients are 1 stalk of celery, 1 onion, juice of 1/2 lemon, juice of 1/2 orange, 1-inch piece of ginger, a touch of white pepper, a 1/2 cup of brown rice vinegar, a 1/2 cup of tamari, which is a fermented soy sauce that is wheat-free, 1¼ cup of canola oil or any other light oil that you'd like, and 4 tablespoons of ketchup. You rinse the kale leaves first and chop them up or tear them into small pieces and put them into a large bowl. And you're going to toss the kale with the 3 tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm sure you've heard of massaging kale. And when you massage the kale, you actually break down the fibers in the leaves and makes it softer and more digestible and more delicious. And also makes the color bright green as opposed to kind of a dusty looking green. So tossing the kale with the olive oil and the quarter teaspoon of salt and massaging the leaves is really important. And you're going to do that for about 5 minutes. And you'll notice the fibers are breaking down, the kale's getting soft, and the color's getting much more vibrant. And that's when you know it's ready. There's nothing that makes me more upset than ordering a kale salad in a restaurant and it looks like it's just a bunch of kale chopped up. It really should not be the color of a bunch of kale when you get a kale salad. It should be bright green. Then you're going to add the cabbage, the carrots, and the cranberries to that bowl with the kale. Using a blender or a food processor, you're going to make the salad dressing, just putting all of the ingredients in together, blending that up, and that's it. Toss the salad with the salad dressing, and you don't need to use all of the salad dressing. You'll have some left over. So do that by taste. Start with, putting in, a 1/2 cup or, a 1/4 cup even, and taste it and see. And the salad dressing will last in the refrigerator for quite a while. So enjoy the recipe. It's something that I love to make. It's so easy to pull together, and it's really, really so delicious. And also, I want to let you know that I am giving Zoom cooking classes every Wednesday evening at 5 o'clock where you can make dinner together with me. Last night we made a Japanese stir-fry with tofu and sesame noodles with a sesame sauce, or rice noodles with a sesame sauce. And it was really delicious. I had 44 people sign up for the Zoom class, and it was really fun. And in 45 minutes, I sent everybody the recipe ahead of time. So if you register, I have your email address, and I can send you the recipe. And then we'll cook together from 5 to 6. We will make dinner. And so by 6 o'clock, you can be sitting down to dinner for you or your family. And it's a lot of fun. I broke open a bottle of wine. We had some wine together, and we shared the hour together cooking and making dinner. So you can sign up on my website for these Zoom classes, and like I said, it will be every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, and now it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Heidi Hutner. She is the director and producer of the film Accidents Can Happen, Voices of Women and Nuclear Disasters. She's a professor of sustainability and English at Stony Brook University and a scholar of nuclear and environmental history and ecofeminism. She's the winner of Sierra Club Long Island's 2015 Environmentalist of the Year Award. And at Stony Brook University, she teaches courses on the environmental literature, history, and film. And she chaired the Sustainability Studies program for 6 years and was Associate Dean in the School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. Heidi publishes widely as a writer and journalist on nuclear, environmental, and gender issues. and she regularly gives public and keynote talks at universities and conferences on environmental studies and ecofeminism. Her current book project, Accidents Can Happen, Voices of Women and Nuclear Disasters, complements the film, which is Accidents Can Happen, The Women of 3 Mile Island. And this book project will accompany the documentary and forms the basis of the film series that she's working on. Hutner's many books, book chapters, and essays have been published by Oxford University Press, University of Virginia Press, and many, many more. She just wrote a piece for Ms. Magazine that we'll probably talk about. She's been on public radio, and she recently appeared on NBC's News Think episode, Clean Water is a Human Right. And she gave a TEDx talk on eco-grief and ecofeminism that is really great. And I will post that link on my website so you can all see that. Heidi was also the associate producer of the off-Broadway climate change musical called Endangered. And it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to Heidi Hutner. Heidi, are you with me?
I'm with you. Hi, Bhavani. Nice. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you so much for joining me during this historic time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I thought maybe, I watched your TEDx talk, and it's great, and it just gave so much of the history of how you got into all of this. And I thought maybe before we get into specific questions about the project you're working on now, maybe you could share with us, how did you get into your work with environmentalism and sustainability and ecofeminism? Can you share that with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So it's a personal story. We had in my family, we had a kind of cluster of cancers. A family of 5, mom, dad, me, and 2 siblings. And my parents and I all had cancer. And my father died from it. My mother died with it. And I was diagnosed a year after my mother's death with cancer. And so that was really a wake-up call for me. And my parents were, we had things like Rachel Carson's book in our house and, Silent Spring. And I grew up hearing of they were anti-nuclear activists in the 50s and 60s and again in the late 70s when that movement resurged. So they were, I grew up hearing about environmental issues. It wasn't necessarily, they did a lot of different things, but that material was sort of in the back of my mind that, maybe pollution in the environment could harm us. And it wasn't the focus of my life for sure. But when I was diagnosed, the third, and my parents were now, had really been impacted by it, by the cancer, I had this kind of wake-up call, and I started asking my oncologist questions. And I said, do you think all the cancers that we're seeing have to do with the environment? And he said, yeah. And I said, do you think it's increasing? And he said, definitely. So that was sort of my beginning. And so during my cancer treatment, I actually started to read a lot. Even though I knew nothing and it was not the field that I was trained for, I was a new PhD in English literature with a focus on the 18th century, and women and colonialism and race. I was not looking at the environment. But in my own kind of separate track, I started to study it. So that was really my beginning. And I was really concerned about pollution in general, toxic pollution. And I read Sandra Steingraber's book, Living Downstream. I went back, of course, and read Rachel Carson, and did a deep dive into, the pollutants in our environment and the impact on human health and also, the health of all living beings.
Yeah. It's interesting how our paths take us in different ways, I didn't start on this path either. I went to art school and, one thing led to the next, and the next thing is food became my palate, and,
right.
We just follow our path. It's interesting.
Right.
So let's talk about this project you're working on right now, where this is the first film that you've worked on, correct?
Yes, it is. I did prior to going to college and doing all the academic work. I had done a lot of work in the theater, and I was an actress. So it's somehow not a big stretch for me, this idea of working with cameras and thinking about the visual and storytelling. So it doesn't feel, in a strange way, even though it's my first film, it doesn't feel like, and it feels very comfortable, I should say. And then the team I'm working with are all very experienced. My co-director, Martijn Hart, and Sveka Vjorst, I'm working with two Dutch people, have lots of experience with making TV, film. That's what they do. That's their professional in this field, and that's mostly what they've done most of their lives. So my background in research, which I bring in, years and years of study, and then I love storytelling, and I do write. At this point, I don't really write traditional academic material. I really do much more work for the general public. I do journalism, and I do narrative nonfiction, which is storytelling. So it's a really good fit.
So, how did you pick 3 Mile Island? And tell us about this story.
Well, it actually picked me. I was working on, and I've written about Rocky Flats, the nuclear facility in Denver. In fact, I have a piece coming out, long reads on that, and I have a chapter on that coming out in a book by Kristen Iverson, who is sort of the most important person to write about Rocky Flats. Her book is amazing, called Full Body Burden, and she has a new anthology coming out, and I have a piece in there. So I've been really I hadn't been to 3 Mile Island yet, and one of the things I do is I go to these locations. I spend a lot of time there. My focus is on women and women's stories in nuclear history. And so I hadn't yet been to 3 Mile Island, actually. And so I got a call, and as I mentioned, I've done, in addition to Rocky Flats, I worked on Fukushima and other locations, and worked with anti-nuclear nuns who do amazing work, protesting and sort of giving their life to protect us against the dangers of nuclear weapons, and many other locations and situations. So I got a call from a woman at 3 Mile Island. Her name is Christine Lehman, and she asked me, would I come speak at their 39th commemoration? And I agreed to go, and that, the rest is history. I went, and I brought, at that point, I was starting to, we were already deciding to make a film about this topic, and I brought my cameraman, I brought my film partner with me. He's also our camera guy, and we fell in love with the people, basically, and their stories grabbed me and have not let go. So for the past 3 years, I've been going there and filming and interviewing and learning and digging, and it's a very complicated story, and it's a very rich story. So so that's how that happened. They grabbed me, basically.
I remember being pregnant in New York City during the 3 Mile Island disaster, and how panicked I was with the winds blowing to New York City, and trying to eat lots of miso soup and keep myself safe because I didn't know a lot, but I knew that it was dangerous and scary, when you don't know anything. And so I remember living through it while being pregnant. So
that's amazing. Yeah, it's interesting because my focus is so much on women and the dangers of pregnancy is a big one. There's just a lot of science that I've learned about how children are most susceptible, girls most of all. One of the things I wrote for Ms. Magazine and elsewhere, it's in a lot of my work, it's really important to know, and it's not really part of our general consciousness or even the regulations on safety for radiation, but women are much more vulnerable and susceptible to exposure to radiation, twice as much as adult men are, and they're nearly twice as likely to get cancer from it and nearly twice as likely to die from exposure to radiation than as adult men, and little girls many, many times more than that. Obviously, the younger they are, the more vulnerable they are. Little boys as well, but little girls most of all, and the fetus is the most vulnerable. And that is not in our safety regulations. So the fact that you bring up pregnancy is really actually an important issue, and so when we learn, when we say, well, this amount is acceptable, which is debatable in terms of exposure. Some people say no exposure is safe, but when we say a certain amount is safe, we have to really reevaluate. It's one of the things that Mary Olson, who's worked on this a lot with the Radiation and Gender Health Project, and also Arjun Makajani's also looked at this really closely. And it's now in materials at the UN that we have to reevaluate safety standards with radiation along gender lines, because it hasn't really been done properly, and it puts our most vulnerable at risk. So,
yeah, well, the same issue is a fact when it comes to pesticides and herbicide safety. You know, they measure it all on, you know, men, big men.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
And they don't take into account, you know, weight and women and children. And so the safety levels, when they say, you know, it's safe to have this much PCBs in your water, or safe to have this much whatever, they're, you know, one, I don't think they even know, but two, they're basing it on men, not women and children. And so all across the board, the safety standards need to be re-looked at.
Exactly.
Now, why is, just out of curiosity, why are women more susceptible to radiation exposure? Do they know why that is?
They don't. I don't think they really know why. And it is possible. One of the scientists, an evolutionary biologist who I work with a lot, Dr. Tim Musso, who does research in Chernobyl and in Fukushima and elsewhere, one of the things he's looking at now, and I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm not sure if the work is published yet, but he was explaining to me that in subsequent generations, men are also impacted. It's not that women aren't, and that they're not, and that those differences may level in subsequent generations. The other thing to remember with radiation is it's mutagenic, which means it doesn't just hurt one generation. It hurts. We damage genes, and it goes on and on into the future, many, many generations. So what happens after the first generation is it does change a bit, he says. But no, we don't know for sure. It may be because the cells are more rapidly dividing, you know, in terms of because of reproduction. We don't know exactly why. We certainly know with children why. They are smaller. There's also the issue of, you know, with exposures, that children are lower to the ground. So, and they tend to put things in their mouth a lot. We know this from the chemical toxicants and the dangers, as you were mentioning, plastics and other synthetic chemicals. Kids put their hands in their mouth, so if they're touching plastics that are toxic, they're having much more immediate connection to it. And then with radiation, their exposures are more direct. They're low to the ground, so they're going to get a more direct exposure with any contaminants in the earth. But I don't think we know precisely. We do know that male sperm is affected from radiation, and that's concerning, both for fertility and also for genetic damage.
Right. Yeah, I know, you know, fertility clinics, you know, women are having much more difficulty getting pregnant these days than they used to. You know, part is, I think, you know, many women are waiting later to get pregnant, but also I think just the environmental toxics are really affecting people's bodies, and it's really becoming a problem.
I can't really comment on that, but I'm interested to learn more about that.
Yeah. No, it's really becoming a problem.
I know that in the year after the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island, infant mortality rates doubled.
Can you say that again?
Surrounding the plant. In the year following the meltdown at 3 Mile Island, infant mortality rates in that community doubled.
Wow. Really amazing.
Yeah.
I want to talk about ecofeminism. I think there's people out there that probably don't even know what ecofeminism is. Can you kind of describe what is ecofeminism? I know this is a topic that you teach a lot about and you write a lot about. So maybe you can talk to us about that, and then how does that connect to this project?
Sure. So that was actually, you know, what happened when I became really interested in environmental issues was I found my way in was really looking, as I mentioned earlier, I was reading Rachel Carson, and then I was reading Sandra Steingraber, who does incredible work on her book Living Downstream is a must-read for everyone. Those two books are incredible. Living Downstream and Silent Spring together are must-reads. And I found, you know, as I put together my first course on environmental issues, I was drawn more and more to women's literature and to women's work on the environment. And I put together my first course on this was ecofeminism, and that course I still teach today. And we're going back, I don't know, 12, 15 years or so. And it was just this grand hit. I mean, the room was packed. Students, it was like, you can't do standing room only because there are fire requirements, because you can only have so many seats in the classroom. But essentially, it was like standing room only. There was a feeling in the room that, when a teacher, when you've got it as a professor, as a teacher, when you have a class that's not a normal class, it was sort of like, this is the class we've been waiting for. That was sort of the atmosphere in the room. And this is before everyone was talking about the environment. This is sort of pre-climate change discussions, and things were just, I remember there was an article, The Environmental Movement is Dead, back 15 years or so ago. I don't know the exact timing, but it was really it was on a conversation that was happening a lot, especially on the East Coast. I mean, I'm originally from California, and what I was teaching was not new for a Northern California crowd, but for Long Island, where I teach, and for the Northeast, it really wasn't sort of in the public radar to talk about feminism and the environment, or really a lot of environmental issues. And the connections just kept going for me to women who were the founding thinkers. I mean, Rachel Carson is the mother of the American environmental movement. That is that's without a doubt. And what is the center of her work? It was DDT, and it actually began on Long Island, actually. But her work on DDT changed our understanding of pollution, and that is really pivotal to where we are with the environment today. What we talk about now, pre World War II and nuclear weapons and all of the synthetic chemicals that were then introduced into the environment. How we talked about the environment was very different. It was about conservation, public parks. It was not really, the focus was not the way it shifted post World War II. And really, Rachel Carson was that shifter. She called attention to synthetic chemicals, and she also talked about the dangers of nuclear weapons and radiation. And that's less known. It wasn't the focus of what she was doing, but she was aware of it. So that I really became interested. What brought her to do that, and what was the voice what was the message and the voice that she was bringing that made that shift, and how did we make that change, and what did she do, and how did she struggle as a woman with that? And it's just a really complex story. As she was attacked as a woman, she was attacked for not being a biological mother. She was, all those kind of feminist questions circled around her. She had to be very private about her personal life. She could not reveal that she had cancer. All those conversations, I think, are part of the ecofeminist conversation. So, and then you can spin out. I mean, I teach about a bunch of different women who have been instrumental in the environmental movement. And it's not that men aren't important and aren't there, and there are lots of wonderful men, but there's an angle for me that's really critical about how information is silenced and how we got to where we are because of that silencing. And that's very much wrapped up in the way women are treated and the denial about information about how we're being harmed and poisoned. And so I'm trying to give you I'm going to try to zero in now on a succinct description of it. So I look at it as two pieces. One, there's the activist piece where I get questions all the time. Why is it when I go to an activist group meeting, it's predominantly women? It tends to be often older, but that's shifting now. All these young people have jumped into the movement, which is amazing. But for a long time, it was older women. Of course, older women have time, they're retired, but you over and over in all the groups I visit, especially with the anti-nuclear movement, it's women. If you think of a lot of leaders, it's women. And then people ask why. Well, I'm not sure exactly why, but there are connections that people, when I interview women, and I've interviewed so many, thousands, they'll say, well, I have to protect my children. It'll come down to my community's been contaminated, and I fear for my kids. And, I was pregnant, like you said, and I worried about, and that was part of really tipped me into real action was when I got pregnant, and I realized I couldn't protect her, that we're living in this planet that's so polluted. And then we live in what I consider a very patriarchal culture. And a patriarchal culture is a top-down, binary culture where one person or a group controls the other, and so I talk about in my classes that this binary is, male, female, Christian, non-Christian, straight, non-straight, straight, non-straight, you can go down the list of these oppressions. And I think it's rooted in where one group has power or one individual has power over a larger group. And we see that, and we see it, another really key piece in there is humans' nature, and humans sit on top of nature and oppress nature in a sense. And so I think that stems in, and ecofeminism sort of argues that stems in a patriarchal structure, that begins way back when with kings who are male and God who is figured as male, and this sort of top-down approach. And what ecofeminism says is that's not working. And it's not even really true. We're not divided. We are interconnected. You know this as someone who works with plants. We are all in a very interconnected ecological web. And every time we try to stamp out or sit on top of or control, it bites us. It's biting us now with this disease. I mean, this started with, wildlife, right? We are abusing wildlife, and it's harming us. We use these chemicals, and it harms us. We create a nuclear weapon. Well, it's going to hurt everyone, right? So that's really, I don't know if that's clear, but to me, it's really about oppression and seeing ourselves as separate from nature. And an ecofeminist approach is not just women. It's everyone can be a feminist. Everyone should be a feminist, right? It's not just for women. It's about interconnectedness. It's about doing away with oppressions and doing away with these binaries, which are all kinds of them. And they trickle down to racism, religionism, sexism in general, and so we talk about the ways in which women are violated historically and talked about historically. It's the exact same language that's used in how we see nature. It's there for us for the taking. It's there, it's fertile. It's ours. We dig, we mine. I was a scholar of the 18th century, and the exact same language when colonists would come and describe America, it was very feminized, and it's all imbued with rape language. And that's how we viewed the land here, and that's how we have viewed historically our environment. It's there for us to take, it's there for us to mine, it's there for us to essentially to rape the land. We've heard that language. And so that's a kind of overview of what ecofeminism is. And in my classes, we look at many different really extraordinary women who have, from scientists to activists to lawyers, who have done incredible work on helping our environment and helping people and animals and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It's the whole issue of, top down and our patriarchal society is, goes across all areas of our society. I know my daughter is a historian, she looks, and a feminist, she looks at, museums, and the artwork in most museums is, white men's art. And it's not like women didn't paint and make sculpture. Right. They're just not represented. Right. So, this goes across all different areas in our society. So thank you for doing that work. It's so important. So I want to talk about your project, but let's take a couple-minute break. And when we come back, I really would like to hear more about the 3 Mile Island project and your book project and how that's all working out together. So everyone, don't go anywhere. My guest is Dr. Heidi Hutner, professor at SUNY Stony Brook, and you're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green. We'll be right back.
Have you ever listened to Anthony Robbins, watched the movie called The Secret, or read about the power of positive thinking from the perspective of any of the many fine authors who have written about the subject? They all focus on the law of attraction, which governs every second of every life of every person in the universe. Like attracts like, and everything you do, feel, and think about as a regular way of being determines your life experiences. PRN's new show, LOA Today, explores all aspects of this magnificent law of the universe every Thursday evening from 7 to 8 p.m. Join hosts Walt Thiessen and Ioana June Thiessen as we explore the law of attraction each week. That's LOA Today, Thursday evenings from 7 to 8 p.m. here on PRN.
Stay up to date with PRN for the latest on the coronavirus. Learn ways to stay spiritually vibrant and physically strong on PRN.FM, the Progressive Radio Network.
Light Treason News, hosted by Allison Kilkenny, interviews fascinating people and wild characters in this political comedy podcast. So tune in Thursdays at 8 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network for pop culture.
Sacha Baron Cohen dresses up as different characters and interviews people, and sometimes they're just like average Americans, and sometimes they're really, really famous politicians and personalities.
Politics.
But we know this song and dance, right? It was called Triangulation during the Clinton years.
Yeah, and it was how we ended up destroying a bunch of the social safety net.
And a sprinkling of treason. Light Treason News on the Progressive Radio Network.
And welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network, and my guest is Dr. Heidi Hutner, professor at Stony Brook and director and producer of the upcoming film Accidents Can Happen. So, Heidi, right before the break, I wanted to talk to you about this project, Accidents Can Happen, and 3 Mile Island, and the book project you're working on that's connected to it.
Yes.
So, just tell us about the project.
Well, the project came out of the book I'm writing, which is about women and nuclear history, and it starts with my mother's story that I found out after she had passed away about her work with a group called Women Strike for Peace, and that group largely helped to stop atmospheric bomb testing in the U.S., UK, and USSR in 1963. And I learned this story after my mom passed away, and as I just mentioned, and the thing that really struck me was why, my first question was, why did I not know this? Seems like a really important story to tell your daughter, tell your kids about. I was a baby at the time, so I didn't know. My siblings probably remembered it, but it wasn't something that was significant, I guess. It just wasn't discussed to my family. And I began digging around. That really tipped me off that there was something going on with women and nuclear that needed deeper looking at. And so I spent that, and that was that was a good while ago, a number of years now. That was before 2009. I learned about this. And then Fukushima happened. And I was already doing research into women and nuclear history. And so I became very involved with Japanese women who came to New York City and right after the Fukushima accident, and they were protesting at the UN, and there were a lot of events around this in New York, and I had a chance to do, that's really when I began my interviewing. I was interviewing older women who'd been part of Women's Strike for Peace prior to this, and was learning a lot about what had happened in the 60s, and then then the movement that was sort of reborn in the 1970s with 3 Mile Island was another, second wave, I would say, of anti-nuclear activism. With Fukushima, I did I sort of dedicated my life for a period of time to that group, and I've written about that. I've published several chapters and articles on my work with the women there. And what I began to see this pattern of activism and change and relationships and families, and then I got pulled into working on Rocky Flats, as I mentioned, which is in Colorado, and so that was the beginning. And then I met my co-director, Martijn, and he was really interested in turning this work into a documentary, and so that's really where it came from. And my focus is particularly on women and women's stories, and I'm really interested in what happens to a community when they experience a disaster. How are they changed? What is the impact on women's roles? One of the things we see at Fukushima, and it's really a similar pattern, is this kind of feminism that arises. So Japan's not terribly feminist, and these are women who, the activists that rose up there and who are still really quite important in terms of doing citizen science and protecting families, and a myriad of things they've been involved with, and policy change, even though they don't have much voice in policy there at all, or in terms of the nuclear industry. There's they have very little power, but they exert a lot of power. What happens is that after a disaster, then these groups rise up and they become activists. They have a sort of feminist awakening, and I've seen this again and again and again where in the community. So I'm very interested in that. What is the change that happens? What is the kind of shift that takes place when you've experienced this? And it's a pattern that I saw starting with my mother's story and starting with the women across the U.S. who banded together to fight to protect their children in the 1950s and early 60s from radiation exposure from nuclear test bombs in the Nevada desert and across the world. And so that's that's sort of the beginnings of how I work, and that turned into kind of a underlying theme in the film.
Maybe you could share with us listening what did happen in 3 Mile Island. I mean, I know, the disaster happened, but then, I remember seeing so many photos of, cattle and livestock just dead on the road and, dead everywhere. What happened to the people? Did a lot of people die from the accident? Did the cancer rate in the town go up? What were some of the ramifications that were seen after that disaster?
Well, as I said earlier, the infant mortality rates doubled. There's two versions. There's the nuclear industry government story, which is not much radiation was released. And so, yes, cancer rates went up. In fact, there's several studies that show the cancer rates went up, but they will not make the governmental officials claim is that, but not enough radiation was released to have caused those. So it's just sort of, okay, they went up, but it has nothing to do with the accident. So we look at that. We look at that, and then we look at alternative versions. We look at what the community had to say about it, what they experienced, and we look at, there's new studies coming out now. There's a study showing, that thyroid cancers in the community, in its initial studies, very well may be specifically connected. The type of thyroid, the type of what disease they're seeing is connected to the radiation exposure. And we talk to a lot of different people from different points of view. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to reveal too much of what we got. But there's the official story, and then there's the local people did their own citizen science, and they also had own experiences. So the people we talked to, lots of cancers. And so and the thing is that the measuring devices went off scale. So some of it we don't know, some of it we do know, but it's somewhat of a mind-boggling that cancer rates went up, and yet officially the statement is, well, but it can't be because of the accident. Just somehow, we don't know why, but they did. And so, and then they restarted the reactor that had been offline. 5 years later. So that was an issue for the local people. They didn't want it to be restarted. But you'll have to see the film to get all the deets. That's what I'll say, because we're still filming. I mean, we filmed most of it, but we're still in production, I should say.
When do you anticipate the film coming out?
I would say in 2021. I mean, now things are a little bit slowed because we don't know. I think and that's assuming we all go back to normal, whatever that means. I don't think we'll go back to quote unquote normal, but it will of course depend on when things reopen, and that's we'll want to release it when people can actually have access to seeing it and so forth. But I would assume 2021. We're targeting that for sure.
Right. Now I know Pennsylvania, and I don't know if it's in the area of 3 Mile Island, but I know they're also really big on fracking. I don't know how that is affecting. I know how fracking is affecting climate change and how it's really bad. I'm curious as to whether the activists there who were mobilizing around the 3 Mile Island and nuclear activism, whether they're also taking up the fracking cause there.
The community that I've been working with, they are mostly focused. The activists who work on 3 Mile Island are really focused on 3 Mile Island, and they don't seem to be. I didn't see a lot of that group being engaged with the fracking. I know about the fracking folks. And I know there's a lot of fracking in Pennsylvania. It's a horrible, horrible thing in Pennsylvania. What's happened. But to my knowledge, they're not really, and they might be because there are other nuclear power plants in 3 Mile Island, in Pennsylvania, which we did not focus on. But to my knowledge, there's kind of no interaction with the direct community with TMI.
And so, what are the connections there that you have uncovered with environmental justice and racism? Are these nuclear plants in compromised communities? Where are you seeing that?
Well, there's a lot of that. I mean, firstly, uranium has a long history. The mining of uranium, which you need, has a long history of environmental injustice. So that is a huge problem. And last summer I was out west, and I was in the Navajo community, and they had a terrible spill months after 3 Mile Island, the worst uranium spill in U.S. history, and that went completely unnoticed. And that's a huge. And I marched with these folks and went to the site where the uranium spill took place, and they have terrible contamination in the Navajo Nation, and they've really been exploited. And we keep wanting to dump our nuclear, and that's another issue. Is you have the nuclear waste from these nuclear power plants, including 3 Mile Island. Where is it going to go? And of course we try to. We have this issue of where are we sending it, what community receives it and has to host it. And the Navajo don't want this nuclear waste, and they're continuously having to deal with this, of being a potential dumping site. And their community is very contaminated. There was a study done with Navajo birth cohort with infants and women, and their babies are born with uranium in their bodies today from uranium mining from a long time ago. That community's really been exploited terribly. And so that's a big issue. And we also see there was contamination in St. Louis. The African-American community there has been really impacted. Amazing work being done. And there was in that world that's where the Black Lives Matter kind of movement began and has a huge impact. And there's work being done showing the sort of environmental injustice to the Black community, and then this sort of double injustice of the uranium contamination there. And globally, there's uranium issues and for the indigenous in Australia and also in Africa, terrible pollution with uranium extraction. And so we have a legacy of, where do the materials come from? What are all the steps in this sort of, we say nuclear is clean. Well, you're missing out on all the beginnings and the endings. So what do you do with the waste? That's certainly not clean. We have no solution for the waste. And and the process of mining it and extracting it is certainly not clean. And of course, all nuclear power plants leak, and we've had a number of accidents. We've had many more than most people know about, because we, in the non-commercial world, there's lots of them. And I follow every day what's happening, and there are near misses constantly. So we hear about the big three, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and 3 Mile Island, and then people will dismiss 3 Mile Island as being significant, and that we're going to argue that that's questionable. We'll show both sides, and Fukushima is ongoing and causing still materials being dumped into the ocean, no solution. Many people lost their homes. One of the women that I interview a lot, and who's in a number of my pieces, a farmer who you'd be very interested in. Her name is Sachiko Sato, and she's one of the first women I met coming out of the Fukushima meltdown. Lost her organic farm. She had to evacuate she has 6 children, had to evacuate them, and never to go home again. Beautiful farm they built by hand. It was an educational center. There was a school. They built every building, she and her husband, by hand, and they could never ever return. And many stories like this, and it's tragic. She had to go back and to retrieve some things, and she had hundreds of chickens, had to kill them all because they were all contaminated. And then other families that left and discovered that they had internal contamination and never to return. And so this is, these are the stories that I'm so interested in looking at. What happens to a family? What changes? What do we do to the landscape? Can it ever be cleaned up? What does that mean to clean up an area? And who can afford to leave? One of the questions people, when I interview people in Fukushima, I say, well, why don't? Because some people did not leave and did have contaminated backyards. They had hot spots in their houses, still do. And I would ask, these activists, I'd say, well, why don't these families leave? And she'd say, that is a privileged question. Where are they going?
Right.
They have mortgages. Right. They have jobs. Where are they going?
Right.
They can't afford to go. The government's not subsidizing their leaving. They're not, the government gave very small subsidies within certain mileage, which they actually expanded what the safe limits were right after the accident, which of course saves them a lot of money. But a lot of people who do live in contaminated areas can't afford to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. And also people don't think about how these accidents affect our food supply. Food
exactly.
This radiation gets into, we were hearing about all the tuna, that was radioactive, that was coming from the Pacific coast. I mean, yeah, it's really horrible. But anyway, I can't believe it. We are just about out of time. So maybe you could just share with everybody who's listening how they maybe could reach out to you if they have any further questions or want to know more about your project.
Sure. So the film has a website, Accidents Can Happen, thefilm.com. I'm very easy to find, Heidi Hutner. I'm at Stony Brook University, so an email pops up. If you just, Heidi Hutner, Stony Brook, you're going to find an email from me. You can always write to me. And I have a website, HeidiHutner.com. Lots of links to all of the things that I write and publish. And I have a video series, which I'm not doing at the moment, but I have wonderful interviews with incredible environmental experts and writers and artists all doing environmental work. And
your
those are wonderful.
TEDx talk is on there too, and that's wonderful for anyone listening who would like to see that. So much for joining us, and everyone who's been listening, thanks for being with us this week, and I'll see you all again next week. And remember to join my Zoom cooking classes.